you've transcended a liminal threshold into History Fuzz, a realm of contemplative inquiry in which leading researchers discuss the motivations, tools and skills of the skywatchers, surveyors, architects and builders who delineated monumental landscapes with awe-inspiring structures, enshrining their diverse cosmic chronicles in stone. I'm your host, Ashley Cowie. You can unlock videos, maps, articles, and enjoy early ad-free new episodes by becoming a member on historyfuzz.com, where you can also apply to join our team exploring and filming archaeology documentaries in the Andean highlands of Colombia. Dr. Kenneth Brophy is a senior lecturer at the Archaeology Department at the University of Glasgow, with 25 years of experience excavating and interpreting Scotland's Neolithic and early Bronze Age landscapes. Kenny and I first met way back in 2002 when he was a young archaeology student excavating standing stones in my homeland of CaIthness on the northeast coast of Scotland, where I was field walking searching for flint or charred arrowheads with one of his colleagues. In this episode, Kenny discusses his fresh academic approach to the pseudo-archaeological 1970s maps of Harry Bell, the renowned Glaswegian lay hunter, who in the steps of Alfred Watkins proposed a network of mytho-astronomical alignments connecting prehistoric sites encompassing Glasgow and central Scotland. We also discuss a significant lunar latitude spanning northern Scotland, and as Scotland's leading authority on the long straight cursus monuments that lead to Neolithic standing stone settings, based on his findings on the mystical western Isle of Arran, Kenny shares his ideas on their ritualistic functionality, stabbing at the meaning of Scotland's geometrical carved stone balls, and the motivation of early death in Neolithic architecture. This is ancient Scotland, according to the case files of Dr. Kenneth Brophy. Could you explain some of the academic research parameters and maybe methodologies that you apply when you're studying archaeoastronomy, and how you define between chance and luck and an intentional alignment?
My approach is quite open-minded, I think, maybe compared to other archaeologists, in the sense that I'm quite open to talk to people about their ideas. I'm quite open-minded about giving theories, even if they seem a bit outlandish, at least a bit of consideration, because I think that as archaeologists we've got a responsibility to engage with a broad range of people, because we don't necessarily have a monopoly in all knowledge, although we are experts in a wide range of archaeological fields. So, I mean, look, over the years I've worked closely with a guy who's a geomancer, and we've had debates and discussions about ley lines and about networks of power and alignments and lines in the landscape. I've done some bits and pieces of research looking at the history of the relationship between archaeologists and lay hunters, which has often been quite antagonistic. And from my point of view, I don't necessarily always agree with some of these archaeoastronomical or the kind of more fringy approaches, but I do also try and be fair to give them consideration. So, I mean, what I mean by that is essentially that I try and root everything in as much as possible in archaeological evidence. So a lot of the approaches that look at orientations and alignments are detached from archaeological evidence or what we know about people in the past or about the socio-cultural structures of societies and groups in the past and so there's a bit of a mismatch. So for me, I'm quite interested in thinking about, well, okay, so why would these people be fixated on these kinds of orientations and alignments? What social purpose would that serve? And is there any actual archaeological evidence on the ground that might substantiate what they say, or maybe cast it in some doubt? So, to give an example, to an area familiar to both of us, CaIthness, as I should pronounce it, where Alexander Thom did a lot of work trying to prove that the multiple stone row sites, like the Hill of Many Stains, were lunar extrapolation sites, which were related to trying to understand the location on the horizon line of lunar standstills. So, on one hand, I can't question the mathematics or the astronomy of that, because I don't really operate at that level. But on the other hand, I can go and dig a hole at this site, excavate the site, look for archaeological evidence that might substantiate or otherwise shed light on what Thom was saying. So Thom's argument depended on the rows having moved, the stones having moved since prehistory, because they don't align up properly for his theory to work. So he came up with all sorts of explanations to explain why these stones must have moved. So I did an excavation, and the stones had not moved since prehistory. They were still in the stone sockets. They hadn't moved. So I was quite content that Thom's theory was wrong. But I'd gone through a process of actually testing it archaeologically, and I hadn't just knee-jerk said, what a lot of rubbish.
I've got something that I would like to share with you. You brought up CaIthness, so tell me what you think about this. Regarding the standing stone fans and their association with lunar astronomy, if you can imagine a band between Helmsdale and Dounreay, would you agree that that is where the concentration of stone fans are found?
Yeah, most of them are there, yeah.
Right. Say you stood at the standing stone fan in Durlot.
Mm-hmm.
Every 18.6 years, when the moon is at its lowest on the horizon, a hierophany is formed in that the moon travels along the horizon behind Morven and Scarabin. If you go to Orkney, the moon is below the horizon.
Mm.
So, would you agree that Learbill Hill is one of the most significant sites in the Highlands, with 10 rows, a quadruple row, a triple row?
Mm-hmm.
Learbill Hill sits on the same latitude with Callanish on the west coast.
I didn't know that.
At Callanish, again on the southern mountains, on the same latitude, you see the moon skimming behind those mountains. So I wonder if maybe those fans are associated to the observation of the moon skirting on the horizon in that band, but maybe the fans are symbolic. Would you think they're more symbolic than actual chronometers?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, I totally agree about Learbill Hill. It's an incredible site. I've been there a couple of times. Absolutely amazing site. I think that what you're saying is right. That this is not about precision measurements and calculations. This is about stage managing, creating effects that are special and magical. And so, if from time to time, and it may well be that this phenomena was only visible at certain times, as you say.
Yeah.
That if that phenomena was going to happen and people knew this is probably when it's going to happen, that would be awesome. And it's an effect that doesn't necessarily depend on everything being millimeter perfect, but it does suggest that there are effects that are being exploited by people in prehistory for various different purposes. So yeah, I'm not going to argue with you that may have been a phenomena that was experienced at those sites.
You've got the woo side of this subject where they present accuracy to within arc seconds of a degree. People in prehistory knew that when we stand here, the moon skims along that horizon, and when we go 20 miles north, it doesn't. And it doesn't even mean the cultures in Callanish and the cultures in Learbill Hill were communicating, but it suggests that they both made monuments to celebrate that lunar phenomenon that happens in that band, and perhaps answers why. If you stand on the Pentland Firth in Stroma, that phenomenon doesn't occur. The moon's below the surface on its 18.6 year standstill. So, for the audience, I met Kenny when I was about... How long ago were you working as an archaeologist in CaIthness? When was that?
It was about... I think we met, it was about 2003, 2004, something like that. So 20 years ago.
20 years ago. So I was going out field walking with Amelia Pannett, and you came up and you were doing a dig, I think, at Halmey and other places with Amelia. Now, one night, you and another archaeologist, two of you came round to my house.
Andrew Baines, yeah.
Andrew Baines. So you came round. Now, Kenny, you won't remember this, but I'm going to tell you now. You're in the living room, and I had been like Alfred Watkins for 5 years, drawing lines on maps. So I unfolded my map in my living room, and you would look, your head looked down, and this is a big moment for me. The first time an archaeologist gets to see anything I've done. You said these words. You went, "Aye, look at that. It all lines up." It was like watching Ricky Gervais with the cringe that I felt, and you sorted me out, right? Because
really?
I started seeing through all this nonsense and really starting to learn what the difference between a castle and a telephone box was on a line kind of thing. And I was trying to sell you a line between Dunbeath Castle and Thurso, and here's why. I'm 24. George Bethune at Dunbeath has convinced me Dunbeath Castle's a Knight Templar castle. And I'm like, well, why would I doubt him?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I must thank you for that. Back there, God, that's a long, long time ago.
I wasn't as open-minded back then. I'm actually surprised that I wasn't a bit ruder.
You must have just seen this so much before, and I was panting like a dog thinking, here's my big moment. This guy could make this or break this for me, my search for the Holy Grail, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah, brilliant. That was great. But it's a very easy trap to fall in when you, back in the day before Google Maps, you had to get a Ordnance Survey map, and you would be drawing lines without the sufficient knowledge that you draw a line in a flat plane, whereas, you know, things are going to go wrong when you project that, and that was all beyond me. But
it's addictive. You know, I mean, I don't know if you've come across the work of Harry Bell in Glasgow.
Yeah.
Who wrote Glasgow's Secret Geometry, which is a kind of a labour of love that he did in the 80s and 90s. It basically mapped lots of linear alignments within the landscape in Glasgow and beyond, created a wonderful map as well. And these were all, he said they were prehistoric routeways, but Harry Bell was a lay hunter in the 70s, but he stopped using the word lay because he had lots of friends who were archaeologists who didn't like it. But, you know, he says in this book, you know, that actually it was like every time he found an alignment, he got a little high, a little hit. You know, the same as, you know, we say now when you get a like on social media, you get a little hit. You know, it was like that for him. It was addictive, you know. And so I've laid out maps before with sites I've excavated, sites I've worked on. I've drawn a few lines, and I think, oh, and then, you know, you can easily see how you can just get sucked into the kind of the focus fixation on the line and not think about what's not on the line. So it's absolutely compelling, you know, and it's fun, but you just always have to have in the back of your mind, you know, okay, is this real?
Right. So before we pressed record, I told Kenny that I had a secret, something I wanted to share with him, and I was intending to keep it till a good half hour from now. But
preempted it.
Yeah. In 2001, 2 years before I met you, I was in East Kilbride, and I was with a man called Chevalier George Stewart, KOTPL. George Stewart was the Knight Commander of the revived Knight Templar Order in Scotland. They were revivalist, greatly made up with members from the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. There was a group of about 30 of them, and I was involved in them. George used to run. You're kidding. I can't believe I'm telling you this. I want to see your face when I get to my first punchline on this. I'm in East Kilbride, and George runs a Printworks. And George turned and said these words to me, Kenny. He goes, "Go and put the kettle on, but take it off they 4 boxes." East Kilbride, take it off they 4 boxes. And I took the kettle off the 4 boxes, Kenny. He says, "We're going to have to get rid of them soon, eh?" He goes, "Oh, my old uncle's no well." He said, "No, my old Uncle Harry Bell's on his last legs, actually."
Oh, my God. It's amazing. I had a wee chill there, Ashley.
So,
wee shiver.
Kenny, George took the lid off his Uncle Harry Bell's box and took out a tube. And I pulled out the map from the tube. I unrolled it on the table. He pointed to Camp Hill, marked on the map, Camp Hill.
Yeah.
The ringwork on the top of Queen's Park.
Yeah.
So this is why 2 years later, in 2003-04, you come up the road and I was drawing lines on maps because I was shown Harry Bell's secret archive, Kenny. At the end of this podcast, I'm going to give you the email address to a man called Archie Young, who is currently the Grand Preceptor of the Modern Knights Templar over in Edinburgh. there's a high chance he has Harry Bell's archive from George.
Wow, that's unbelievable. That's incredible. Well, that's.
I've been wanting to tell you this for so long. So there's a line on that map
Mm-hmm.
that has appeared in none of his works. None of his works.
Mm-hmm.
And it's amazing. So here you go. The Devil's Plantation,
Mm-hmm.
or the Bonnyton Cairn,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Bronze Age.
Yeah.
He had that marked on the map, but what he had plumbed a meridian perfectly north on a 4 meters variance from the tip of Earl's Seat, the highest mountain in the Campsie Range north of Glasgow.
Mm.
A Bronze Age meridian, perhaps, from the highest hill in the region.
Mm.
What's your thoughts on Harry Bell's unpublished Deal's Meridian?
Well, I mean, I think that it's incredible that there's some unpublished stuff there that he didn't actually. And I wonder if maybe he didn't publish it because he was too ill by then, or maybe he was. I don't know, but I mean, with all Harry Bell's alignments, you've got to consider what you included on the line, what's there, what's not on it. But there's no reason why that couldn't be quite a special discovery, because you've got a sight line that's that direct north, and these things are significant and were understood in prehistory. And the Battle Moss Stone Rose and CaIthness that I excavated are aligned almost perfectly north south. So these significances are not shouldn't be dismissed. So I'm certainly not gonna dismiss it, and it sounds something that I'd like to investigate further.
Let me take this in a level. So my mate George Stewart, his uncle Harry Bell, shared lots of Templar history and research. Now, Kenny, in Chinnen Abbey, given by David I of Scotland to the Templars in 1128, George and the rest of these modern revivalist Templars were convinced that so too was there a site where Glasgow Cathedral was founded by King David I 20 years after in Chinnen Abbey. And they're convinced that there is Templar significance at these two sites. However, the Templar burial stones in Chinnen Abbey were made at the Govan Old Church, by the Govan School. They were Govan School work.
Yeah.
Recently, the Govan Old Church has been associated with the temple as well. Kenny, the Govan Old Church and the centre of the choir in Glasgow Cathedral are within meters of the same equinox line. So here's what the implication is.
Mm-hmm.
Standing at Govan Old Church, looking up the Clyde on the equinox, the sun rises above the cathedral and crowns it.
Yeah.
See, when you extrapolate that equinox line across, this is where it gets beautiful. It dissects Roslin Chapel.
That's interesting.
The centres of the two buildings are 123 metres off a shared latitude. It was Govan, Necropolis, Roslin. Just west of Roslin is Temple in Midlothian, which was the first Templar site that was given by King David in the same year as he gave Enchannon on the other end of the line, 1128. I think, like what I was in my early 20s, what Harry Bell was all his life, is this. We've got backpacks that are 95% constituted with horse shit. But in that, there's 5% nuggets. Would you agree that within the matrix of alignments, there are probably quite significant Bronze Age or maybe even Neolithic alignments?
Yeah, I think that if you actually started to take apart the alignments and what constitutes them, and then you started to focus really on the stuff that's likely to be contemporary with each other and strip out the Roman sites. There's a Mesolithic flint scatter and all sorts of other stuff in there. And then, I think there's a possibility that they could be capturing some kind of solstice alignment. So, I'm certainly not going to rule it out. And I think that, ultimately, Harry Bell's background was in lay hunting, because his first book, Forgotten Footsteps, which I managed to get a copy of in a charity shop in Stirling a few years ago at a very nice price as well, is a ley line book. And I haven't looked at it for a while, but I wonder whether that line you're talking about across the whole of the centre of Scotland is one that's in that book, because that was he called that the first ley line book written about Scotland, and
Yeah.
it's about central Scotland. It's not a Glasgow focus, so I'm going to go back now and look at that and see what's in there.
So the way the Templars present this as an ecclesiastical equinox line that occurred with the founding of Glasgow Cathedral. Now, shaving away the Templars, when a cathedral's founded, generally it represents the new prime meridian for any cartographic or astronomical exercises, but it also represents a significant latitude. The way the Templars used to talk about it was this, that to dominate that latitudinal band was something that the Romans did as well, and they expressed it with the building of the Antonine Wall. Because that latitude, where Glasgow Cathedral, Edinburgh are on, represents kind of the north of the known world, if you like. Beyond such a latitude just lies us heathens, you know?
Yeah.
I lived in Tantallon Road for 3 years, Kenny, so the Camp Hill site was 350 metres from my house. I spent nights and nights and nights up at that site, and I always used to find the alignment between Camp Hill and the necropolis particularly mesmerising.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because on Harry Bell's map, that particular alignment, Camp Hill to the necropolis, he noted that alignment as the straight road with no path.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
I am wondering if his straight road with no path is referring to the aforementioned line of latitude, which is a straight line with no path.
Mm.
It's a thought.
It's exciting. I didn't know that the kind of whole Templar thing. I didn't know he was into that really. So that's interesting.
I can't believe we're talking. I was wanting to talk to you about Neolithic meridians, about Bronze Age solstice alignments, and we're at the heart of Templars and Harry Bell.
Mm.
When we're done, I'm going to email you Archie McPherson's email address, and you're just going to ask him, say, I've been speaking to Ashley Cowie, you used to be in touch with them.
Yeah.
Do you have Harry Bell's 4-box archive? Apparently, George used to go drinking in the Eglinton Arms with Harry Bell. He was a big man in the jazz nights in there. So George used to go boozing in there with him.
Oh, yeah, that's it, yeah.
Oh, I wasn't even going to mention Harry Bell and George Stewart and all that to you, but I think you'd agree. If you ignore the last 60 years of ley lines and all this nonsense, you're actually rejecting a hugely important part of British cultural history.
It's a really interesting creative practice that's about a passion for landscape in the past, and I think that's admirable. I love it. I love that stuff, and obviously, there's stuff that came later on, the kind of Earth mystery stuff, which diverted away from that. But ultimately, that Watkins stuff is great, and the way that he was treated by the archaeological establishment was terrible. So
Watkins never said energy. This is the big scary word. It's when you say Earth energy. It's when that comes into it, that's when it gets just woo. And Watkins didn't personally say that himself. What I found beautiful was Watkins inspired Bell. George used to say that it was absolutely directly Watkins that inspired Bell. And
absolutely.
There's a very similar thing, like in this, when 10 years after Watkins' book came out in France, around where, the Battle of Elise, the last sort of fight, if you like, between the Celtic French and the Romans, the Battle of Elise, 10 years after Watkins' book, this crazy French historian went, it wasn't located there, it was further south in another Elise. That guy, Kenny, created this matrix of lunar alignments and mountain alignments from this church in France, and it's just like your Harry Bell in Scotland. It's just like your Rennes-le-Château in the south of France. But what I found, I went through that entire thing, all his maps, and I looked at them, plotted them on Google Earth, got right into it, and I published it because in the middle of that, he notes that the highest mountain in the region is a solstice alignment to a cairn. And he's selling hard. This is a megalithic part of this network. On that solstice alignment from the top mountain to the cairn are, in a 7-mile range, are 6 18th century churches, all on that alignment. And so he missed it.
Wow.
He missed a beautiful piece of French church architecture adhering to the local solstice. But he presented this huge thing saying that the word Elais actually was from the Eleusinian mystery schools in Greece, and this was a remote Greek esoteric temple in France. He was great with all that, but missed a beautiful church alignment,
Yeah.
So in the north of Scotland, when do you think an importance was put on cardinality, on aligning with the main cycles of the sun, the moon, and perhaps the stars? Can you identify a moment?
Well, let's go back further to Warren Field, which is a Mesolithic alignment of pits on the River Dee, which the pits were dug about 8,000 to 7,000 BC, and Vince Gaffney has argued that that was a solstice alignment. That was the pits were actually guiding um, the view of people along a valley to a notch in a mountain where they could view solstice events, and that there was maybe a couple of posts thrown up as well just to help that alignment. So you could, if you, and not everyone buys that interpretation, but it was published in Internet Archaeology, and it was it was quite robust in terms of the way that they went about the work there. And I'm not going to argue with Vince Gaffney about anything. So so you could look back and say, well, maybe hunter gatherers were also, were kind of starting to play about with solstice alignments. There's an interesting line of pine posts near where Stonehenge eventually ended up being, which again, perhaps was an alignment in the landscape. So we're starting to understand a bit more about Mesolithic monumentality in Britain now as well. But so, that's just to throw it out there.
I have to interrupt, mate. You just broke one of the podcast rules. I forgot to say to you, I try at all costs not to talk about Stonehenge.
Oh, well, usually it's the last thing I want to talk about, but
good man.
Yes, so I'll never mention it again.
The listeners know exactly what the reason is. I mean, I write news articles, Kenny, and it doesn't matter what is found. My editor will say, you know it, older than Stonehenge. And you're like, well, it's also older than a lot of other things,
Yeah, Scotland, Stonehenge, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So if we're looking for alignments, cardinality, then maybe we can take it back further. But in terms of the Neolithic, then probably I would imagine quite early on there was an interest in there must have been, of course, an interest in the movement of the sun, moon, and stars. And I think that as soon as people started to erect posts, they started to manipulate the landscape, clear trees, create more views and vistas within the landscape. I'm sure that was when they started to think about, well, when we leave this tomb, then there's a visual effect to be had at certain times of the year, and whether and so we know that there are some Cursus monuments, and for instance the Dorset Cursus, which has got a solstice event which is visible along the length of the Cursus. Some other Cursus monuments have got moon associations. Not all of them do, but some do. So that and those are obviously very straight lines in the landscape, which lend themselves well to guiding movement and visibility to certain places in the horizon line. So I would have thought that it would be very, very, very within the first few generations of people farming, there would have been attempts to try and use monumentality and manipulations of the landscape to highlight these kinds of solar events.
When do you think in Scotland the first stones were put into place to mark this? You think that one in Aberdeen represents something that was culturally widespread, or do you think it came with the building of the first stone rows and then cairns? Where are we, about 3000 BC? Do you think it started becoming monumental?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's when we start to have the first kind of standing stones being erected in various different places and configurations. So, yeah, I would have thought that's probably when it started to be. It moved beyond a stick or a bit of wood to being something a bit more permanent, but also a bit, but also there's a world of difference between a stick and a massive stone, that's got a very irregular shape. And so these are very crude devices for accurate recording, but they're very good for it's good enough. That's that's my kind of sense about the kind of the capturing and documentation, recording and measuring of solstice events and so on in prehistory. All they had to do was that it was good enough that they knew where to look and when.
Aye.
It didn't have to be, you have to stand in this exact position in this minute, and then look, through this little notch, and it just had to be good enough, to serve the social purposes of the people back then.
Have you, in any of your teaching methods or teaching processes, adopted artificial intelligence to try and better explain the ancient world? For example, before I spoke to you, I typed in to double check myself what, based on the astronomical latitude of Rosslyn Chapel and that of Glasgow Cathedral, what is the variance in latitude? And it does all the equations, gives you the whole breakdown, and goes 123 meters. Do you use AI yet? Do you use AI yet?
I haven't actually used it in any of my teaching yet. Partly I've been on research leave for a wee while, so I've managed to avoid doing teaching because it's only really in this academic year that it's suddenly become an issue for us. But as usual with academics, it's all about plagiarism. What are we going to do now? Because students can just do essays through ChatGPT and things like that. So, but I mean, I've spoken to colleagues who have used it for helping frame and structure things, to come up with strategies to kind of maybe finesse kind of summaries of project designs and stuff like that. And so, I've used it a couple for kind of having bits of fun about, like write a strategy for recruiting new members for the Glasgow Archaeological Society, and it came up with a fantastic strategy. But from my perspective, it's got huge potential to help us and help archaeologists to think through problems, to kind of come up with proposals for projects. And I think it's got huge teaching potential. We're only really getting to grips with just now because we're slowly getting over the hurdle of the AI as a problem and thinking, well, actually, this is an opportunity to work with students. And to be honest with you, I suspect that most of our students are probably much more proficient at using it than we are as academics are. So, I think that they'll teach us a few things as well when we go back. So certainly I'm going to explore how to use it in teaching when I'm back from research leave, because it's got massive potential, which is often overshadowed by the scare stories in the media about being about the end of the world and that kind of stuff. So I prefer to think about it as being a force for good if it's in the right hands and if it's done, responsibly. And I'm sure it will be for the most part, and certainly it's going to be used by archaeologists. Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's actually going to be quite a good way for us to work out how good our exam and essay questions are, because we often have questions that have got ambiguous words in them, and we don't necessarily pick up on that, and AI will when you actually run it through, and then you'll think, well, wait a minute, that's not what I expected the answer to be, and it's because it's actually the question that's wrong and not the answer. So I think it's definitely interesting that our own questions can be scrutinised through it as well.
You're right, because the student's qualification shouldn't be based on any one doctor's ability to write a question properly.
No, definitely not. No.
What I'll do is, if I'm working in an area, no longer do I get out Google Maps and draw it, because the Google map is an approximation of a distance on the Earth, projected onto a hypothetical globe, if you like. And the Earth isn't round. But Kenny, I can take the data from 10 sites and I just have to cut and paste it into ChatGPT, and I can say to it, within a band of 2 arc seconds, show me meridional correspondences with these longitudes. And it gives you it. And it'll go, from those 12 locations, only 3 lie within 2 arc seconds or 10 meters on the ground. I think that's really, really strong potential for analyzing big data pertaining to especially archaeoastronomy, when there's so much data out there, so many sites, so many standing stones, so many notches and so many hills. To have AI look at that kind of data and say, strip out the absolute knots and show us the stuff within bands of error, I think that's a powerful application.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think big data is an increasing issue in archaeology in general, with just huge data sets that we're now having to try and come to grips with, and then how they interrelate with each other. So this might help our modest brains to try and keep up with all this kind of stuff.
See, coming off AI and going back to 3000 BC, I'm going to ask you a question, and don't give me the safe answer saying, it's been said, some believe. What do you think the primary purpose for those enigmatic Neolithic stone balls might be?
I think that they were closely related to the material they're made from, and they represented places. There was a really nice piece of work done by Chris Moffat. Can't quite remember his name now. I examined his PhD, but he did a book came out recently where he did a really powerful analysis of all of the geological sources of all the Carstone balls, and I really like the idea, that they actually were. Richard Bradley's talked about this idea of polystone actually being pieces of places, and I think that these Carstone balls represent different places and the different materials are made from. So there's something about them being kind of, and they're also very tactile objects as well. So I'm not going to fall back on there's as you know yourself, there's a million and one different ideas and theories about what these were for, but for me there's just magical objects. They're really special, and I think that the materiality, the colors of the stone, the kind of the fabric of the stone it comes through the creation, and how tactile they are. They're really special objects, but I don't think they served any mundane everyday purpose. I don't think they were like used for hunting or
You don't?
measures or weights or anything like that. No, I think they were kind of special magical objects that maybe inspired people to talk about the stories or their families or the place they came from, or I don't know. But that's a pretty woolly answer, because I didn't expect you to ask me about Carstone balls.
No, you didn't. But now I've got your answer. I'm going to ask you another question based on that. Right. So,
Yeah, that's fine.
a Carstone ball is something special in your eyes rather than a utilitarian object like a weight, for example.
Mm.
Why then were half of them found in rivers? Why would such special objects be found in rivers?
People were buried in rivers in prehistory. They threw swords, axes, metalwork into rivers and watery places. So I guess we shouldn't necessarily correlate things in rivers as being disposed of or thrown away, but actually that might be an appropriate or powerful place for somewhere to end its life. So that's how I'd answer that.
I did a talk at the Orkney International Science Festival about this.
Mm-hmm.
What I suggested was this. Perhaps accounting for half of them being found in rivers is that accepting fishing was an enormous part of their life. Maybe fishermen twined their lines around it and kept them in their wee bag there, and they could change lines when on boats, and then the lines don't get ragged up and tied on boats, get caught up in their bags, and they have fishing lines wound around these balls. And then my second proposition was that the monuments in Orkney are built to within less than half a degree of accuracy within the hole. They must then have used ropes that were calibrated to within half a degree of accuracy. A rope on any given day, Kenny, depending if it's humid or dry, can shrink or stretch more than 4 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
A knot can swell over a degree. Everybody pulls a rope at a different tension, so they must have used exceptionally well calibrated strings and ropes. So perhaps the sacred measuring strings were kept around these balls. 2 theories. What do you think?
I think that's nice. I like that. I like that combination of the organic and the stone. I'd be interested to actually get hold of one and start sort of wrapping some string around it and see how that might work. But I don't see why not. And I think, yeah, on you go. Tell me.
I wrote a book, Kenny, 8 years ago called The Rope Age.
Mm.
What I did was I took all of the artifacts found in Skara Brae and I reinterpreted them, the ones that were regarded as ceremonial and perhaps ritual. You know the hammerhead tool, the famous icon for Skara Brae?
Mm-hmm.
If you put that on the top of a rod, it makes a perfect surveyor's tool, and it's even got 6-degree angles marked on the top, which is the variance at Brodgar.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the tools at Skara Brae can be associated with rope mending, rope repairing, and rope measuring crafts. And I like to think that the production of calibrated measuring ropes was central to the people that were controlling the building of the monuments.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that accounts for these resins that they found in the pots in Skara Brae. Those could possibly have been the same as they used in Egypt, where they were using animal waxes and resins to assure calibrated ropes didn't change length.
Mm.
And I've always thought about that. Those stone balls could be perhaps for once you've greased your string, you wrap it, wind it round until that rope sets, if you like, it does all its shrinking and its stretching. And you could slowly heat those balls up around the fire to encourage that calibration process to occur.
Hmm.
So I went right head first into the rope age, but it really pissed off a lot of people that were convinced that Scarabray represents, I think you have a colleague, Ewan McPherson, perhaps his name is? Mackie.
Ewan Mackay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because he was always convinced that the monuments of Orkney could only have been achieved by a class of proto-scientific astronomer priests.
That's right. Yep.
Crazy kind of island-based college of esoteric mathematics. What a thought. But I'm finding that it was a fishing colony, possibly associated themselves with whales because there was so much whale matter found in Scarabray.
Mm.
I'd like to throw another question at you because you're arguably one of Scotland's leading authorities on cursus monuments.
I am the leading authority on cursus monuments in Scotland.
Yeah. Would you associate the curses with the creation of sacred ceremonial causeways and walkways in other countries?
I think that they may well have served that kind of role within Neolithic societies. I mean, I'm not sure how it would relate to elsewhere, but I think that the creation of sacred routeways, roads that kind of have a religious and ceremonial connotation is something that's is universal, and so I think it's part of that process. I mean, I think that cursus monuments were probably had a number of different roles within early Neolithic society, but in Britain, which is the only place that they're, in Ireland, the only places are found. But I think that the part of it was about controlling movement within a ritual or religious context. So, I think that those kind of parallels are fair enough, that they were, they served those kinds of roles. Yeah.
Would you agree with this proposition that it all seems to be about progression to the center?
Mm.
Whether it's causeway leading to the center of a temple, a Hindu temple, or whether it's a holy road leading to the center of our trading environment. Do you find that the cursuses are leading towards centrality of some kind?
I think that they are in some cases. There is an obvious leading into something which you could see as a central focal point. In others, it's not quite so clear, because we don't really know what was either end or what they're running towards. But like the site I've been working on for the last couple of years at Drumadoon on the island of Arran, the cursus there, I think, is very much about taking people to not literally to the center of the island, but to the kind of the center or the heart of the ceremonial life of the island at Machrie Moor, which is a famous site with stone circles and timber circles. And the cursus is taking people who are arriving, presumably as pilgrims, or arriving in the harbour at Blackwater, what we call the Blackwater Foot, then walking along the cursus, and then having this landscape of timber circles and mountains revealed to them at the end of the monument. So it's the end of a pilgrimage, and it's taking you into this kind of the heart of Neolithic Arran. So I think that that some of these sites were certainly serving that purpose, that they were taking people from one place to another, and the end of that journey was almost certainly some deeply significant event or place that would have been really powerful for them to experience. And so these cursus monuments are kind of servicing that in some cases. I'm not sure about all, but in many cases.
This is a sacred island in the Neolithic times. How far afield might people have come for that experience?
It's probably quite far afield. Certainly from Ireland, people were coming across. And within the bank of the cursus, we found flint tools made from Antrim flint. So that this flint from Ireland is coming across. Pitchstone from Arran's going back to Ireland. And so there's an exchange of lithic tools going on, as well as people moving around. Arran's an incredibly well-connected place in terms of its location. So from Arran, you can get into the Highlands through the Highland Glens and up the Argyll Glens. You can get into central Scotland through kind of Glasgow, Clyde, and then into over the other side of the country. It's connected to Ireland. It's got strong connections down to the southwest of Scotland, and then you're into the Irish Sea and the Isle of Man and Cumbria and so on. So I think it's a place that I'm sure that people would have ended up on Arran who'd come from hundreds of miles away and had kind of sea crossings to get there as well. So it would have been known. I mean, how it is known, we don't know, but it would have been, some kind of magical, powerful island that perhaps produced this incredible, glassy, sharp pitch stone, which is a kind of obsidian-like material, which is only found in Arran. There's nothing else like it in Scotland. So that would have, and the mountains, and so it would have been a really potent combination, and people would have come from all over to actually experience that, and then perhaps take away a little pitchstone souvenir at the end of the trip as well. So yeah, it would have been a magical place, and it would have been a real melting pot of people from all over the place.
Kenny, was the sanctified island inhabited full time by a priestly class? Were people coming from all round, say, once or twice a year for major events? Was it like a Palm Springs that everyone flew into twice a year? What's your thoughts there, Kenny?
I think it would have been a bit more of there would have been a local population there that would have acted perhaps as like tour guides, that they would have shown people around. Priestly class, I don't know, because that's kind of going back to the sort of Ewan Mackay's idea of what was going on, but there would have been religious and political leaders who perhaps were the ones who met and did the meeting and greeting of people and had the esoteric knowledge to guide people through the island experience.
Yeah.
But we also know, bringing this back to the archaeological evidence, that in the Neolithic, Arran was being farmed. So we've got very good evidence for scratch ploughing, for cereal growing, for farming and cultivation. We're increasingly starting to find hints of Neolithic settlement and some timber buildings as well. So I think there was a population of people who were there, who were farming and living all year round. And then there was like a kind of a steady stream of people who were turning up, perhaps either by appointment or just randomly turning up and then having those engagements. And that's what we don't understand. We don't know how it was managed and how it was mediated. We don't know to what extent there was control and ownership of the resources and the curses, and to what extent was it a free-for-all, and to what extent was it really tightly managed and controlled. And those are the kind of interpersonal relationships that is really difficult to get to in prehistory and understand how that was managed. But the archaeological evidence tells us that people were living on Arran all year round, but that doesn't necessarily tell us much about the people who are rolling up to the island and saying, show us the cursus, where's the pitchstone, and that kind of thing. So yeah, I think there's a mixture of the archaeology and then having to sort of try and think about the human dynamics of how it might have worked.
But do you suggest the whole island was ritualized? Or are there any parts of the island that quite clearly weren't used in this? Or is it centered on Macrymore itself?
More than Macrymore. I mean, there's like it's more the south of the island, the southern half, which is the kind of the less hilly, mountainous part of the island, has got lots of megalithic chambered cairns. There's timber circles, there's stone circles, lots of standing stones. There's a lot going on. And then the north of the island, which is mountainous, there's very little evidence found for human occupation in prehistory, and it's quite quiet. And that's perhaps just because it was a less good place to live, or it's perhaps because archaeologists are rubbish at finding upland Neolithic sites, which is certainly true. Or it could just be that the south of the island was where all the action was. So it's difficult to tell, but I think that it was more than Macrymore. But I think Macrymore was the kind of the heart of the island. It's just such a recurring special place with the timber monumentality, and then later on, all of it being replaced by stone monuments. Lots of burials in the landscape. It's never stopped being a focal point. It is now as well today. It just draws you in because it's such a magical place. So I think that it wasn't all about Macrymore, but it must have been unavoidable that Macrymore was the main focal point of activity on the island.
And of course, Scotland's surrounded with islands. There must have been so many miniature versions of this at that time.
Yeah, I think that one thing that we could and should do is actually explore a lot more small islands and see what's there, because in the Neolithic they were quite adept at jumping in boats and island hopping, which is one of the ways they would have travelled around up the coast. And there's lots of islands around that there's been almost no archaeological fieldwork done. No one lives in the island anymore, and that potential has never really been explored. In terms of who was there, what were they doing? Because Neolithic people must have been on these islands, even if they weren't actually doing anything other than maybe going over on a boat and leaving some sheep there, which is a it's the same as you do in Iceland and the Faroes, where they leave sheep on little islands and then they get all of the grass to themselves. So I think that we don't really have a good understanding of that little small island archaeology. There was a really good project that was by Fraser Sturt and Duncan Garrow a few years ago, the Stepping Stones project, where they looked at how farming gradually moved up the west of Britain, and they looked at islands and they looked at settlement sites. But I think there's a lot more islands, smaller islands, that we just have never looked at and never considered. And I think you're right that we may well find kind of like mad little kind of small islands that maybe had just have had a few timber posts, or had like a kind of a little cell where someone stayed, or someone went there and camped over the summer. And these are things that are difficult to pick up in the archaeological record.
It seems so abstract that at such an early time, an entire country, Scotland and its islands, would be peppered with these Neolithic monuments. But when you consider that people were dying at 32, I mean, 32 is an average. That means a lot of people at 18, Kenny.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you not think that plays a huge part of the inspiration for such monumentality?
I think that what you said about lifespans is really important, because they had a kind of an accelerated life. And we often think about people in the Neolithic, it was a slow life. They didn't have much to do, and they just spent their time tending their animals and polishing axes. But actually, it was a quick life. That was probably lived quite harshly, and everything was accelerated. Like
Aye.
girls would have had children younger. There would have been a very high infant mortality rates. People would have got old quicker. You could have died from you can cut your finger and die from an infection. It's a totally different dynamic from what we have now. Death is just always around the corner. And so, I mean, from my perspective, it doesn't matter what period you're looking at in the human past. Humans are always trying to come to terms with, understand, and mediate death and get to grips with it. So it's no surprise that in the Neolithic there was so much focus on the monumentality of death, the architecture of death, because it was always present for them. And ultimately the ancestors were present as well, because they were in those tombs and they were accessible. They weren't locked away. They weren't buried under the ground or under a pile of stones. They were accessible ancestors.
Yep.
And that must have been part of their process of how they came to grips with death, because they would say, well, okay, that's my grandfather, and he's revered. He's in this tomb with all of our other ancestors. He's very close by to where we're living. If we want, we can go and look at his skull. That'll be me one day, and that I think there's a kind of comfort in that. So maybe it's not even anything more complicated other than just the comfort of knowing that when you die, you will become part of this kind of beloved community of ancestors that are kind of encased within these stone monuments that are not tombs, but they're houses for the dead. So I think it's a response to that, live fast and die young lifestyle that people had in the Neolithic.
A man dies twice. Once when his heart stops, and the second time when his name is said for the last time.
Yeah.
You understand where I'm going, putting that in context of the Neolithic people?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's really esoteric, but it's quite profound, and I think it makes so much sense, because what you're suggesting is, whereas today we go to church for a funeral or go to church to pray, the entire Neolithic landscape was like a living church, wasn't it? It was a living spiritual network as much as it was temporal.
Yeah, and it was alive with the ancestors, and that thing about their names is really important. So here's something for you to respond to. One, I've been thinking about multiple stone rows a lot over the years, and at some point I'll actually finish the book which I've been working on. But one of the ideas I had about those sites was that they were essentially stone genealogical sites. So you have all of these rows. The rows represent different families. When someone dies, a stone is added to the row, which is why the rows are all wobbly. And then children can walk along through the monument and be taught their ancestors' names. Every stone represents a different generation of the dead. So they keep alive the memory of their ancestors by enshrining within these stone fans, these stone monuments. That's one of my ideas. Okay.
Your idea there is lovely, theoretically. What that would suggest then is that the larger, as let's say a fan or a row setting, the larger it is, suggests a bigger population in that area, a more sustained amount of death going on.
Mm-hmm.
So would you suggest then that the Hill of Many Stains had more people living in that area compared to, say, Ben Dorrery, where there's a row? How did you have you matched that up with populations?
No, I haven't. You might have found a flaw in my theory there. No, I haven't. I haven't actually. But I think that that's actually that's really nice. I mean, I think that you can correlate the size of the stone monument with the local population, or you could correlate it with the people who associate as kin of the founder of that monument, who might not necessarily live in the same vicinity, is one way that you could get around, or you could sort of argue. But I also hoist by my own petard of going back to the archaeological evidence, yes. But then when were they built? You know, if they're early Bronze Age, then there's loads of Bronze Age settlement. If they're Neolithic, I don't know. There's virtually no Neolithic settlement in CaIthness. So, but yeah, I think you're right that an idea can be compelling and can be nice, but it has to be grounded in some kind of objective reality to an extent.
Aye, that's all very good, you protecting yourself academically, but the truth is, Kenny, the idea has to come first.
Yeah.
Then it finds its grounding, but the idea drops and then it gets shaped and molded and looked at. But I think as a concept, it's an exceptionally human interpretation. Back to Learbull Hill, where you've got 10 rows, you've got a quadruple row. I wonder if the alignments point towards maybe points of inhabitation of the lineages, like we were on that hill, we were in that glen. What evidence is there of burials beneath stone rows? Any?
Yes, there is evidence for most of them. Or most of them have got a kist that's kind of at the apex of the fan, and those contain burials. Joseph Anderson excavated quite a few in the 19th century, and they usually contain beaker burials. So a lot of the sites, not all of them, but the majority of them have a burial association, and of course that burial is that the founding father, the founding person that's at the center of the monument that everyone else is relating themselves to. So, they are burial monuments maybe in their first incarnation, but then they become much more like sort of memorial because because the stones themselves aren't physically burial markers. They're not gravestones because we've excavated at Batomos and there's nothing like that at all. But they are representing people. But they're not actually but there is a burial at the heart of these monuments.
The reason I asked that question is if I was to try and skeptically contrast your proposition, I would have to say, so on the very first level, show me that those rows have some association with death. So there is an association with death concurrent with these rows. So that does warrant a further go then, because you've got that base connection, association with the death of people.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it can go in a lot of different places. So, yeah. So I've written a lot of stuff about this, which is currently in a manuscript form, but there's more to be done. There's more to be done.
I love that, Kenny. If you said to me, right, Ash, you've got 10 years to look at this, or you've got 10 years to try and support Tom's lunar chronometer, I would look at this perhaps more than trying to bat that drum again.
But what I would also say, though, is that the only person that's ever, in the last 100 years, that's ever shown these sites any attention was Tom.
And Les Myatt, his buddy.
Les Myatt did some stuff locally. And he was really informed by Tom. But, if it wasn't for Tom, we'd know almost nothing about these sites because it was all back to the 1911 inventories and so on. So, regardless of, Tom's theories, he did the hard yards. He did it all. He was out there in his summer holidays with his theodolite and his son, measuring all these sites, while most archaeologists couldn't give a toss. And I think that's why he's an admirable character.
He runs parallel with Harry Bell.
Yeah.
In an altogether different way. He does. He was out in the field with his theodolites, with his plumb lines.
Yeah.
You represent the only human being alive I could have this conversation with. Do you understand that?
That's probably true.
Kenny, we're going to leave this on a quote from Harry Bell, who was famous for having said about somebody he met in Glasgow that he was nothing short of a geographical buffoon.
Yeah, I'd remember reading that, yeah.
Thanks a lot for coming on, and hopefully we'll have you on again in the future when there's some other things come up.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Thanks.
If you enjoyed this episode, hit subscribe, drop a 5-star review, or share it with a friend. And you can get in touch with me through historyfuzz.com.